What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today, we're gonna be learning Azure in under 90 minutes. Now, Azure holds a special place in my heart because it was the first cloud platform that I ever learned, and I absolutely love it. And so I'm super excited to get started on this with you. We're gonna be taking a look at a lot of things within Azure. We're gonna be looking at storage accounts, we'll be using SQL Databases, we'll be looking at Azure Synapse Analytics, as well as Azure Data Factory. These are some incredible tools within Azure to use data, to use SQL databases, to create ETL pipelines, and a ton more. So you're gonna be learning a lot in just this lesson. So without further ado, let's jump on my screen and get started.
We're gonna start right here on the azure.microsoft.com/free over here. Now, this is gonna be a little bit different if you're in a different country, but this is for me here in the US. But I'll have this link in the description so that you can come to it. You can create your account, and then we'll get into all of the UI and how everything looks once you actually set up our account. Now, before we actually create it, just go down here. Here's some of the things that you're going to get when you create your account. You're going to get popular services free for 12 months, which is really, really great. 55 services that you're always going to be free. And then we're going to get this credit right here. Now, this credit is really important because some of the things that we're going to be looking at in this series are not things that are completely free all the time. So we're going to be using some of this credit throughout this series. So you want to make sure you can get that. You just need to create a new account, and that's what we're going to be doing. And then we don't have to use our money. We can use Azure's money, and we will all thank them for that. Let's come over here. We're going to click on Start Free. So we're going to start our free trial. Now, if you already have an account, you can use it. If not, we're going to click on Use Another Account. Now, again, for this, you can sign in with things like GitHub. You can sign in with a previous account. If you do not have an account, I'm just going to show you how to create one really quickly, and that's what we'll use going forward. If you already have an account, if you're already signed in, go ahead and skip a little bit forward, maybe like a minute or so, and we should be done creating this account. But let's go ahead and see how we can do one. We're going to go to Create One. We're going to call this Alex the Analyst at Outlook.com. And there we go. So we have Outlook, or we can do Hotmail. Hotmail feels like it's from like the 90s. So I'm going to do Outlook, at least feels somewhat current. And then we need to create our password. I don't want any tips. So I'm going to do a password right here. And let's go ahead and click Next. You're going to fill in when you were born, and we'll go ahead and click Next. And it should be creating our account. Looks like we need to do a little puzzle here. Looks like we need to rotate it where it's pointing. And there we go. So now we're signed into our Microsoft account, but now we need to actually create an Azure account. And those are two separate things. So you need two accounts. So we're going to go through, we're going to fill in all of this information, your name, your phone number, your address, and all these different things. Then we're going to have to fill out our card, so a debit card or credit card, so that we can actually, if we go over the $200, or if we use a service that is not free, then it is going to charge us. We won't be doing that, thank goodness, but you do need to have a card on file in case you do that. Let's go ahead and fill out all this information, then we'll go to the next part. All right, so we just created our profile. Now we need to identify our verification by card. One thing I will note, in the profile, I did have to verify my phone number. So they sent me a text, I put in the number, and there you go. Next thing we need to do is we need to put in our debit card. So go ahead and do that. And once we fill that out, you're going to see this right here, which is a little welcome to Microsoft. You can go ahead and look through this if you'd like. I'm just going to get out of it because we don't really need it. Now, this is going to be the first thing that you see. This is just the homepage of Azure. This is where you can access different services and resources and look at your profile and notifications and all these different things. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is just take a look at some of these resources, because there are a lot of resources within Azure. And so if we come down right here, let's go ahead and click into one of these. This is Azure Synapse Analytics. If we want to actually use Azure Synapse Analytics, we need to create a Synapse workspace. So then we can start using this resource and start using this application. And all we would have to do is create this. So we'd come in here to create Synapse workspace. We would start filling out all of these things, and then we would actually have access to that resource. And so this one specifically is one that we will be looking at in this series. Let's go down and just really quickly take a look at some of these. We're going to be looking at data factories, so creating workflows and data pipelines. We will be using Azure Synapse Analytics. And if we go down to databases, we'll take a look at SQL databases, as well as maybe one or two others, because knowing how to use databases with the resources within Azure is actually quite important. And then if we go down to storage, way down here, let's keep going. If we go into storage, we will be looking at storage accounts, and that's actually where you can access something like a data lake. And so this can be pretty intimidating just looking at this because there's so many different things. But in this series, we'll really focus in on the things that I think you need to know that you're definitely going to be using as a data professional or especially a data analyst. But even things like, let's come back up here. Even things like data factories are used by data engineers, database developers, data scientists, it's everybody. And so knowing how to use these tools within Azure, extremely important. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in the next several lessons. We'll be getting into specific resources within Azure and how to use them. So that is all we're going to take a look at in this lesson because we're just getting set up, creating the accounts, looking at some of kind of the user interface of how Azure actually looks. And in the next several lessons, we'll be diving in, getting hands-on experience with a lot of these tools.
Now, account storage is super important within Azure. This is where a lot of companies are going to store a lot of their data. Using account storage in Azure is a super flexible way to store your data. It can store just about anything, and you can even upgrade it into a data lake. And so we'll be taking a look at all these things in this lesson just to get you familiar with how to use account storage because you absolutely will be using that within Azure. Without further ado, let's jump on my screen and take a look.
So let's start by taking a look at our resources. Right here in storage, we have our storage accounts. Now, as you can see, there's lots of different options for storage, but by far the one that you're probably going to use the most is storage accounts. Now, we do have right over here, you'll notice Data Lake Storage Gen 1. If we click into this, and let's say we wanted to create a data lake. It says right up here, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 1 will be retired on February 29th of 2024. We recommend that you migrate your Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 1 to Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, and that is located in the storage account. So let's come back here. We're going to go right into storage accounts, and let's really quickly set up a storage account. Now, this is some helpful information if you've never used a storage account before. It says you can store about 500 terabytes. It has general purpose storage use for object stores, NoSQL data store. You can define and use queries for message processing, and you can also set up file shares. At the very end, we have blob storage accounts for hot and cool access tiers. These are all things that we'll look at in this lesson. And so that is just kind of a preview of a lot of the things that we're going to be looking at. So let's go ahead and create our storage account. Now, this is a brand new account as we set it up in the last lesson. So I'm going to be walking through this with you as if I have a brand new account. Now, you have to have your subscription, which if you're using the free tier, you'll have a free Azure subscription. But we have to have a resource group. Now, we haven't created a resource group. Let's go ahead and create a new one. And we'll just call this one Alex the Analyst. And we'll click OK. Next, we need to specify a storage account name. We'll call this one Alex the Analyst Storage. I'm guessing that's unique. The storage account name has to be unique across all of Azure. So if you type in something kind of generic, usually it will already have been taken. So you have to do something pretty specific. Now, this part and the next part, these are pretty important. This region says choose the Azure region that's right for you and your customers. Not all storage account configurations are available in all regions. Now, if you're just setting this up for yourself, just to store some data on the cloud, or you have a little app that you're creating or something like that, it's very easy. You're just going to select your local region. And for me, that's US East. But what if you have a company or a product or an app that's being used by people all around the world? For example, you have a client-facing app that they're using and they're going in and they're retrieving data from some type of storage account. Or maybe they're running a query on your website of data that's stored in a storage account. And what's happening is it's stored locally to you, but they're way over here in, let's say they're in central India. And so in order to get from central India to the US, it's going to take a lot longer to retrieve that data. And so it could take 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds for it to get to them in India versus if it's just locally in US East. And so you need to know where your customers or where your clients are located who are going to be using this. Now, just for this lesson, we're going to keep it in East US because that's where I am located. But that is something you really need to consider, especially as you get more advanced with using Azure. But, just for the basics, you don't really need to be thinking about that. I just want to walk you through my thought process as we're going through this. Next, we have to specify our performance. This is just going to determine how quickly and how easily you can retrieve your data. We're just going to go with standard, but premium would just allow you to retrieve that data even quicker. Next, we have redundancy. Now, redundancy is important, and it's one of the benefits of the cloud, which is if a server goes out that's storing your data, they're going to have a backup of that data somewhere else. And you can specify where that is going to be located. You can either do it a locally redundant storage, a geo-redundant storage, a zone-redundant storage, or a geo-zone redundant storage. And so if your data is super important, it is critical to what your website does. It is critical to your clients. If it was deleted by accident in any way or destroyed in any way, your whole company would collapse. You're going to choose this one down here. But if it's just some local files that you're uploading for someone to pick up, and it's not that important, you're going to do something like locally redundant storage. And so that's what we'll choose. Just something to consider, though. Now, there are other things you can do in advanced networking, data protection, encryption, tags, and all these different things. But if I'm being honest, 99% of the time, you're never going to use any of these unless you really, really, really know what you're doing, or that's your job. You're some type of database administrator creating these storage accounts for people on your team. Most likely, you're never doing that. So let's go down here. We're going to click Create. And it's going to say we have our deployment in progress. So it's going to start creating the resources needed for that storage account. And then we're going to actually get into the storage account and start using it. And just like that, it took about 10 seconds. It says that your deployment is complete. We don't need to go to the resource up here. We're going to go to the resource right here. Now, what we're looking at is the user interface for this specific storage account. So we have Alex, the analyst storage. If we go back to all services, we come into storage accounts, you can now see that we have one. We don't have to just have that boilerplate text and then create. If we want to create another one, we'll come right up here. But we can come into this storage account and we can look at this overview. So this is just some of the information on the location, the subscription ID, the type of performance, the replication or redundancy, and a few other things as well. Now, there's a ton of things on this sidebar on this left-hand side. We have things like activity log, tags, diagnosis, solve problems, access, data migration, events, storage browser, storage mover, and all these different options. And it's kind of overwhelming, but I know just from experience that you're not going to use almost any of these. In fact, things like monitoring are typically used, like something like logs, are typically used by IT if there's an issue. Most likely, you're not going to be coming in here and taking a look at all these things or creating different alerts. You may be working with metrics if you're in the IT department. But again, a lot of this stuff you're not going to be working with specifically. Most of the time, we're going to be here in this storage browser. And this is where the data is actually uploaded, stored, and accessed. So if you come in here, let's come up here to a blob container. Let's say we want to create a blob container just to store a bunch of data. Maybe it's for a client or an application or whatever. We just want to be able to store that data in the cloud. And this is kind of the simplest version of being able to use the storage browser or just storage in general. So what we can do is we can add a container. Now we're going to name this container. We'll call this ATA container. There we go. And if we come down here, we do have an advanced tab. You're most likely not going to use it because this is deals with encryption. And this is completely, as a sidebar above and beyond what you probably need to know. But when you start trying to access data later on in different applications, whether it's a SQL database or you're using it in Power BI or whatever you're using this data for, if you have it encrypted, you're going to have a way to unencrypt it within Azure. And so it is an additional level of security, but it makes it a little bit more difficult to access that data later on if it's not super sensitive data. So just something to think about. Let's go ahead and create this. And now we have this ATA container. So we're doing great over here. So we've already created a storage account. We've gone into the storage browser. We've created a container. And these blob containers are amazing. I've used them thousands of times for so many different things. And blob containers are really just used for anything. Anything you need, you can use and you can dump inside of a blob container, whether it's structured, semi-structured, or unstructured data. And so let's see how that actually works. So let's go into this, and we have nothing in here, and we want to upload some data. So let's come up here to upload, and we're going to go and browse for some files. So in here, we have a bunch of different files. We have a SQL text file, a PNG, which is just an image, a Jupyter notebook file, and a CSV. All of these are completely different. None of these are similar almost any way. And so what we're going to do is we're going to select all of these. We're going to open these up. and we can upload these. But really quickly, let's come in here and take a look at some of these advanced options, because this part actually is something that you might use. Now, really the most important one in here is this access tier. If we hover over it, it's this piece that's kind of important. It says optimize storage costs by placing your data in the appropriate access tier. And you can come over here and look at all the access tiers if you'd like. But let's take a look at what these access tiers look like and what they actually do. We have 4 options. We have hot, cool, cold, and archive. Now, this refers to how the data is actually going to be stored in the blob storage. If it is hot, that means that you can just retrieve it anytime you want right away within milliseconds. It's just going to be ready to go and it's going to be there for you. But if you go with an option like cool or cold, it's not going to be there hot and ready just to be able to pick up and use that data. It's going to be sitting in a data store where if you want to retrieve it, you may have to wait a little bit. And so these options are actually a lot more cost effective, because if you're not using that data actively, you can just plop it in there as a data store where you're not using it for any application or any project, and you have the data stored securely, but you don't have to pay a ton of money for it. Whereas if you store it in hot, it's going to cost more money to store that. Lastly is archive, and archive means you most likely won't ever use it. This is a contract that was signed 6 years ago. You need it on file, but most likely you're never going to use this. If you do, you're willing to wait 5 or 10 minutes because it's not going to be an emergency to get that data or that file or whatever it is. And so these are the different tiers that you can use. Now we'll just use hot because that is the default option. But if you have a use case where it's not important that that data is quickly accessible, you don't need it right away, then these other options are going to be a lot cheaper. So let's come down here. We're going to go ahead and upload these files, and there we go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually upload one more, and this is going to be for a future lesson when we actually access some of this data. We're going to browse for files, and we're going to select CSV file 2. I just made a copy of this, and all we're going to do is we're going to open this up. And for this, we're going to choose, you can do any of these, honestly, but let's put it in archive just to have the most dramatic effect. Let's go ahead and upload this. And as you can see here in this access tier, we have hot inferred, and then we have archive. And so later on in a future lesson, when we try to access some of this data, we're going to try to access both of these, and you'll see what actually happens when you have data stored in archive or cool or cold. It's quite similar. We'll see how these are retrieved. Now, the next thing that I want to take a look at is right over here under settings. Now, under settings, you'll see this Data Lake Gen 2 upgrade. Let's go ahead and click on this. It says that you can upgrade to a storage account with Azure Data Lake Gen 2 capabilities. So if you need things like data analytics and big data storage, you should consider upgrading to Azure Data Lake Gen 2. Now, we're not diving into data lakes within Azure. I may do that in a future lesson, but this is where you can access to create a data lake. You can upgrade your storage account into a data lake. They used to have a completely separate Data Lake Gen 1, which is what we just looked at earlier, but now this is all located within the storage account, so you just upgrade from this location. Then you'll have those data lake capabilities. So that's just something that I wanted to mention while we're here. Now, the last thing that I actually want to look at within the storage account is actually the IAM, which is the access control. Now, within here, you're going to have complete access to this, because if you come over here and view your access, you can see that you're going to have grants full access to manage everything. And if you come over here, you can read it more. You have access to everything because you created it. But what if we want other people to have access to this? Because right now, this is a private account. Nobody else can access this. If you want other people to have access to this, you're just going to go to add. You can add a role assignment or a co-administrator. Let's just say we're going to add a role assignment. You can say this person has the ability to read, but you can't make any changes. So I'm going to click on this one. Then I'm going to come up here to members. Now, right now, I am the only person in my Azure account. So if I wanted to add somebody, let's say Bob, if I wanted to add Bob, he'd have to have an Azure account. But I would click on Bob and I'd say, okay, I'm going to give Bob this access. I'm going to select him, and we're going to give him just the read access. We don't want him to, delete all of our files by accident. He's not the brightest bulb of the bunch. So we're just going to give him that access, review and assign. And we'll go ahead and add that role assignment. Now you can see that my access, I am an owner, but I'm also a reader. And so that is how you grant access to storage accounts. You can also create roles, deny assignments, create classic administrators. But typically this is done by a database administrator, but it is something that is extremely, extremely frustrating about Azure just in general, because any single tiny thing you want to do within Azure, you're going to have to request access. And so when you're first getting started up at a company, they're going to give you a lot of the base access. They're going to, create your accounts. They're going to give you some access to Power BI or the data lake or a SQL database. But whenever you want to use anything outside of that, you have to request IAM access. And so that's just something I want you to be aware of, because if you want access to specific storage accounts, you're saying, oh, this team, wants me to work on their data or use something with their data, but I don't have access to it. That's because you weren't given access to it. You just have to request it or go to your database administrator, whoever runs that, to ask for permission. And so that's kind of the nuts and bolts of what most people are going to use storage accounts for. There are things like file shares, queues, tables. Honestly, you don't use them that much. And so I'm not going to dive into it. These blob containers within storage accounts, the data lake, which is an upgradable option. These are kind of the more important things. And so knowing how to store, where to store, and all these different options is very important. And so we'll be coming back to some of this data or putting in new data for different lessons when we actually start accessing data within a storage account.
By now, I think you all know how much I love SQL. I think it's one of the best skills for any data professional to have, but using it in the cloud is a little bit different than using it on your local computer. So in this lesson, we're gonna see how you can use a SQL database in Azure. Without further ado, let's jump on my screen and take a look.
All right, so the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna come right in here into databases under the resources. Now we have a lot of different options in here, and there's a ton of different databases that you can choose from, and it kind of depends on what your company does. I'm only going to be showing you the SQL databases, but other popular ones are things like using MySQL or PostgreSQL with flexible servers, as well as things like Azure Cosmos DB. They all have different use cases, and they all have different ways that they are implemented, but by far the most common, the one that I've used the most in my career, is SQL databases. So let's come right in here. And what we need to do is we need to create a SQL database. And let's click on create SQL database. And let's actually create it, and then we'll see how we can use it. So what we're going to do is come right down here to subscription. We have to select our resource group, which you should have already created. Let's create a database name. Let's call this Alex the Analyst DB for database. Now we have to select a server, but we haven't created a server. So we need to create a new server. And again, I'm going to call this, I'll do ATA for Alex the Analyst. I'll call this server. It looks like it needs to be lowercase. Let's do ATA server. And then we'll do YT at the end, have to make it unique. There we go. All right. We're overcoming some hurdles here. Next, we have to choose an authentication method. We can use the Microsoft Entra only authentication, SQL and the Entra authentication, or just SQL authentication. Now, what that means is if you come in here and set your Microsoft Entra admin, you can set it as yourself. And that does help if you're already signed into Azure, you're going to be using it within Azure. This can be very helpful. And it's actually kind of the default method. Let's get out of here. This is the default method. If you come down here, though, you can also create an admin login and a password. Both of these have their place, and sometimes you need to use both. And so just choose the authentication method that you want for that server. For us, I think we're just going to stick with the Entra admin. We can always change that if we want to. So let's go ahead and we're going to select ourselves here. We're going to select that, and there we go. Let's go ahead and click OK. And that should create our server, and there it goes. And now we need to finish creating our SQL database. So do you want to use a SQL Elastic pool? If you look at this tooltip right here, basically helps you manage your resources, but we're not going to be looking at the Elastic pools. For our workload environment, we're just going to choose development. Production is going to be a lot faster because if it's in a production environment, you're going to want better speed, better compute, all these different things. Development is going to be a little bit slower. We can also choose a cheaper database or a more budget-friendly database. So we don't have to choose what it gives us. We can come in here and we can define this. So maybe you want to have a provision tier instead of serverless, which I don't really recommend. Serverless is quite nice for scalability. But we're just going to keep it as is. But if you want to come in here and change some of this configuration, you're free to do that. Just don't, if you don't know what it is, I wouldn't mess with it. Well, let's come back to the Create SQL Databases. And then we have our backup storage redundancy. You can either do locally, zone, or geo. We're just going to stick with our local. Let's go ahead to review and create. It's going to tell us our cost, which is very, very, very low. If you don't even have the free $200 that they're giving you, which can be used for this, it's going to cost you like $1 for what we're going to be doing, or maybe even like 10 cents, if I'm being honest. Let's go ahead and create this. It's going to take a little bit of time to set up all these servers and all the databases and all those things. And then once it is done, we'll take a look. All right, so our deployment is complete. You can come in here and look at some of the details. We created SQL Databases, the servers, SQL Server, SQL Server. And so all these things are ready to go. Let's go ahead and click on Go to Resource. And let's exit out of this. All this information is just an overview of our SQL database. Now, we have down here some of the more important things that we're going to be taking a look at. We're not going to be diving into all of them because I'm just going to show you the most common way. Now we have configure access, connect to application, and start developing. Now, in the real world, when people are actually using these SQL databases and when they are getting in here and setting everything up, you can do this in a few different ways. One is you can connect to a MySQL database. And this is a very common practice where they connect it to a database management system. It could be MySQL Workbench or a ton of others that are out there. And you can do that by configuring it. And you're going to get some of that information. You're going to plug it in and connect it. What we're going to be looking at is not that option, although that is something that happens often. I'm going to show you Azure's tool for this, and it's going to be Open Azure Data Studio. So we're going to open up Azure Data Studio. We're going to click on this right here. And you're going to need to download the Azure Data Studio. Now, I already have this, so I'm going to come down here and go to Azure Data Studio. And this should resemble a few different things. It should resemble a little bit of Visual Studio Code, and it should resemble something like Microsoft SQL Server. It's kind of a combination of both. You have a search, you have some notebooks that you can use, different projects, an explorer, source control, extensions. It has a ton of stuff. And so this was really popular when I was using Azure. Everybody used this, as well as sometimes we connected to MySQL databases or Microsoft SQL Server databases and just use those database management systems. But oftentimes we would have everything in Azure Data Studio. So let's come right up here. We are going to connect. Now we have to specify our server name. Let's go back really quickly. We're going to come right over here. We're going to go back to this right here. We need to select our server. So this is our server. It's ATA server YT. We could even come in here into the server and we can just copy this if we want to. But we're going to get that. We have our server. We have our Windows authentication type. And so it can either be a SQL login, a Windows authentication, but we chose the Microsoft Entra ID. Now right here is recognizing the Analyst Builder at Outlook.com. That was for the course that I have on Analyst Builder for AWS and Azure. We need to add in our Alex the Analyst at Outlook.com. So let's come in here and we need to sign into our account. So let's go ahead and sign in. And there you go. Your account was added successfully. Let's go back. And there we go. Now we're signed in and we need to select our database. Now it's not popping up the database right away, which should be called like Alex the Analyst DB or something like that. Let's go ahead and try to connect and see what happens. It looks like we're getting an error here. I think, let's actually come back here. I think our server name is actually this one right here. I just chose the actual server, but this is the connection that we actually need to make. So I'm actually quite certain about that. Let's go ahead and click on this. And now it's saying our connection was denied since deny public network access is set to yes. So this is something I was waiting to see because we need to configure this just a little bit. So let's come over here and we need to go to configure access. So we're going to select configure and it says public network access is disabled, but we can enable this. And then what we can do is we can add in our IP address. So we're going to add in your client IPv4 address. And all we have to do is click save. So now it's going to update and it's going to say, okay, you can access this. Let's not, get too crazy and too wild here. Now we can go back and we're going to select this and we already have that selected. So now you can see that we have our two databases. We have the master, which is the one that you're going to get, and then we have the one that we actually created. So all of that to show that you do have to configure a few things, make sure you're doing it properly. And now we can come down here and we can connect to it. And so now right in here, We can come into our tables. We don't have any tables, but we can come into these tables and views and all of these different things. Now we can actually use this. So now we are connected to our resource. We're connected to our server, and we can actually access the databases, create them, do all of our querying, all of our things that we need to do with our data. And we have all these options on the left-hand side. Now, this isn't an Azure Data Studio tutorial, but there's tons of stuff that you can do in here. So if you've used something Azure Data Studio, or if you've used Microsoft SQL Server, this should seem really familiar. You should feel right at home. Now, I want you to be able to actually use this. I don't just want this to be something pretty. So I need to show you one other thing that you need to do. Let's go ahead and try to create a table here. Right down here, we have this script, create new table. We can keep it new table just with the one column. It doesn't really matter. Let's just say this is ready to go. Let's go ahead and publish these changes. Then we're going to come down here and we're going to update our database. Now we can come over here and we have a new table. So we can actually open this up. We'll select the top 1000. And of course we don't have any data in it, but we have a working table. So now this table is being stored on a server in a cloud. And this is great. So if you've ever used something like Microsoft SQL Server, you have all these tables and databases and all these things you're working with. That's how it's actually used in the real world, except you'd probably see a ton more tables. You'd have access to a bunch of different servers for different clients and different data. So that worked perfect. And what you can now do is let's do Control N, just get a new query window available. I'm going to paste in here just like this. We're already selecting our database. We don't have to say use this database go. I'm just, that's what I'm used to. So I'm going to keep it in there for any, if you have put this in a stored procedure or something like that, I don't want it to fail out. But this is just a super simple table. And we're going to go ahead and run this. Looks like that should be done. Let's refresh, or actually refresh this table, and we have this product. So let's open this up. And now we have data in here. This are little underlined in red. Sometimes if you do Control Alt R, it'll refresh it, or maybe it's Control Shift R. That's okay. It'll get rid of it eventually. It just doesn't recognize it yet, but it will. So anyways, we have our data in here, and now we can write regular queries. And so this isn't a SQL lesson. I'm not going to show you how to write SQL, but I have hundreds of other lessons and courses on how to learn SQL. And so this is kind of the nuts and bolts of how you set everything up. And this is how people actually use it. So this shouldn't be too intimidating if you know how to use MySQL Workbench or Microsoft SQL Server. And so that is really awesome. Now, if we come back here, we're just going to take a look at a few more things. This is just within our server, but we don't want to look at our server. We want to go back to our database. So we're within our SQL database right here. We're going to look at a little bit of configuration and Azure Data Studio. Again, remember, if you need to connect it to MySQL or something like that. Now, just within the SQL database, there are a few other things that you can do. One, they have something called a query editor where you can come in here and you can query off of, let's say you have tables you can query off of in here. I can assure you that almost nobody ever uses this, almost ever. This is not really something that people use. It's there to kind of test connections sometimes. So if you're just setting up a new server or a new server or new database or whatever it is, you can kind of check to make sure it's working, but you won't use this in your real work. It's just doesn't make sense. Now let's come over here and take a look at this left-hand side. There are some interesting things that I want to show you. One is this Power Platform. When you start working with a large amount of data, you have a server and a database set up and you're using it and you have tons of real data in there. You're like, okay, now it's time to connect this. Well, you can use things like Power BI, Power Apps, and Power Automate. All these things just kind of automatically integrate into it. There's also integrations, but just knowing how these are actually used, you most likely won't use them. But just knowing kind of what these are and how they work, you most likely won't use these too much. For people like you and I, Power BI is something that we'll probably use quite a bit. And we most likely won't use monitoring too much. But I will say I've had to come into the monitoring quite a bit over my years to debug a bunch of stuff. So if a stored procedure is failing, if the database is failing and you need to figure it out, you can come into the logs. If you need to see how much compute, how many resources you're using, you can look at the metrics. So there are some reasons to come in here. Typically though, this is more IT related. This isn't as much of what a data analyst will typically do unless you work, like I said, in IT, where they monitor a lot of those things to keep costs down and keep things running and going smoothly.
Azure Data Factory is a super cool tool within Azure because it allows you to create data pipelines and different workflows workflows to extract data and clean data, transform it, and put it places. And so it does a lot of different things. It's one of those skills that I started using when I started getting a little bit more advanced in Azure, but I don't think you have to wait till you're really advanced as an analyst or a data scientist or engineer. I think you should start learning it now because it's a really, really great skill to know. So with all that being said, let's jump on my screen and take a look.
All right, so let's get started by coming right down here to Analytics. And under here, we have Data Factories. Let's go ahead and click on it. And let's create a data factory. So let's come in here. We need to give it a name, choose our resource group, and we'll be rocking and rolling. So let's call this the Alex, the Analyst, and we'll do ADF, just like that. For the region, we're good. And for version, we only have one option. So let's go and review and create this. Now, as we know, this is going to be deploying this. It's going to take just a minute, and then it'll be done, and then we'll get going. And there we go. That literally took maybe 15 seconds. And so just set up the Data Factory version 2, and let's go to our resource, and there we go. Now, this should look fairly straightforward. We just have some of this information up here. We have our Launch Studio, and then down here we have some of the monitoring. So when you're actually running these automated systems, pipelines, everything that we're going to be doing, you have some data on it, and you can see some of the data on that. Now, they do have some quick starts, tutorials, template galleries, and training modules. Go ahead and take those because I've looked at a lot of these and they're really great. But what we're going to be doing in this lesson, which we're going to cover a lot of stuff, is I'm going to help get you set up. I'm going to help show you how to do different things. And there's going to be a lot of stuff that we cover. So I'm going to be moving pretty quick, but let's go ahead and launch our studio. And here we go. So this is the Azure Data Factory. There's a bunch of different things that we can do in here. We can ingest data, we can orchestrate, so create code-free data pipelines, and we can transform data. Now we're going to be looking at a lot of this, but not all of it, so stick with me. The first thing that we are going to do is we're going to work on an ingestion, because being able to pull data in is actually a pretty important thing to know how to do. We're just going to select Run Once, and we're going to select Next. Now, there's a lot of different places that you can ingest data from where your source data is stored. But for us, we are going to select the data that we put in the last lesson. So in our last lesson, we have put some data in a SQL database, which this is our server right here, ATA server YT. And we have this table right here. So we're going to ingest this data. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come over here. We're going to type in SQL. Should have Azure SQL Database, should be right there. And we don't have a connection yet, so let's just select our new connection. This is basically like connecting to the Azure Data Studio before. And so this should seem really, really familiar. So we have our ATA server YT, we have our Alex the Analyst DB. And so now we should, for our Azure subscription, we have our subscription. And let me go back because now it's not remembering. So what we need to do now is we need to select our system assigned managed identity. So our managed identity is this one right here, Alex the Analyst ADF. Now that's going to be really important in just a second because this is by far the most confusing and frustrating part of doing this if you've never done this before. So let's just say we want to go ahead and create this. It was successfully created, but we're getting this connection failed. And if we look at this, it says it cannot connect to it because basically it cannot open the server requested by the login. Now, what we need to do is we need to edit this and we need to do something quite important. We need to take this managed identity name and we're going to actually update our database and make sure that this identity name is in there so it recognizes it and can connect to it. So let's go ahead and copy this and let's come right over here. Let me make sure I have that. There you go. Let's do Control N in our Azure Data Studio. Now, this right here is the most important thing, but we have to put that in a few different places. So I'm going to write out all the code and then I'll explain it to you and I'll have it to where you can just copy and paste it yourself. You don't have to write it all out. All right, so I went ahead and wrote everything out. What we're doing is we're creating a user, and that's going to be our user for Azure Data Factory that we have right here. So we're adding that and then we're altering the role to make them a member so that we can get access. Now, if we run just this, let's go ahead and run this. You'll notice that we don't have anything in this database principals and this database role members. This is our sys databases. So we're just checking there isn't that account in there. So what we now need to run is this top part. And again, I'll have this as a copy and paste down below. Let's go ahead and run this. And it looks like it worked. And now let's check these two queries again. And there we are. So now we are in both of these sys databases or sys tables that we need to be in. So we should be good to go. Let's go ahead and go back, and we're going to come right in here. And now that we have all that connected, let's make sure, let's make sure everything's good in here. Let's go ahead and test this connection. And there we go. You can see that the connection is successful. Now what we can do is cancel out of here, because now this should be working. Now what we need to do next is select what data we actually want in the output. Let's go ahead and select our products. We'll select next. You can preview the data if you want, but we don't need to do any of that right now. Let's go ahead and select next. Now, where are we going to place this data? Because we have data sitting over here in Azure Data Studio, right in here, that we want. And let's say we want to put it in the Azure Blob Storage. Maybe this is a report or some type of query that we want to send to a client. And so that's what we're going to do. To get it into the Azure Blob Storage, we need to select our subscription and our account storage name, and we'll go down here to create. Next, we have to choose our folder path. So let's pull up our storage account. We can duplicate this over here, and let's come back and let's see if we can get it right here. Here's our storage account. Let's go to Alex the Analyst Storage. Let's go to our storage browser. And we're going to go to our blob containers. Now we should have one blob container in here. Here we go, ATA container. So we can come back here. We're just going to select browse. I did all that just to show you where the data was coming from, but that's in our storage account over here. Or is it called account storage? Storage accounts. If we just come in here and we say, okay, we want a file, that doesn't really work because we're putting data into something. So we can't put it into a different file. We need to select a folder that we're going to place it into. So we're going to select the ATA container. We're going to select OK. For our file name, we'll call this one SQL Database Output. And that should be good. Let's go ahead and select next. Now, these are file format settings. We need to specify how we actually want this data to sit once we move it into the blob storage. Now, this is a delimited text, but you can choose JSON files or C files, Parquet files, whichever files you want. So we're going to do a comma delimited file, which should be a CSV. We shouldn't need to add any compression onto it because this isn't a massive amount of data or multiple files at all. So we should be able to go ahead and select next. Next, we need to specify our task name. Now we're going to call this one SQL to blob, and we should be good to select next. And this is the whole process. So we have Azure SQL Database going to Azure Blob Storage. Let's go all the way down. We'll select next, and this is creating this. It says our whole deployment is complete. It validated the copy runtime environment, created the data sets, created the pipelines, and ran the pipelines. Go ahead and select finish. If we come over here to our storage, you can see that right here we have our SQL database output. And let's see if we can just click into it real quick. Let's go ahead and download this just to see what it looks like. I'm just going to put this in downloads. We'll go ahead and save that. If we open up this file, just ignore those pictures of me and my wife on the Segway. If we open up this file, we can open it up as let's just open up a notepad. And you can see here's our data. Now, this isn't in a CSV format, and that's okay because it's really easy to change it, but it is CSV separated. So it was a text file. It was meant to be, I kind of wanted it to be a CSV, but we can very easily change that if we do .csv here. And now we've changed it into a CSV. Let's open it up. And there we go. So you can definitely change that, and we may actually look at that at some point in this lesson, but very easy to change that to a CSV file because it is comma separated. So all this looks great. This looks really, really good. I don't need to save this. Let's go ahead and go back. Now let's go back to Azure Data Factory. One thing I want to point out really quickly before we get into some other things is for our recent resources, we have our SQL to blob. You can find that right over here in this author. So when we go over to author, you can find our pipelines, and we have some data sets as well from our destination and our source data set, but that's regardless of what we're looking at. In our pipelines, we built our SQL to blob. So if we come over here, this is what it's doing, and we can click on this and we can see kind of what it's doing down here. We have our source data. That's where the data is coming from. That's our table. You can also have it write a query. So you can change this to write a query from that table if you want to do some advanced stuff. this data is super simple, but if we wanted to just select units in stock where it's greater than 100, right? You can just write the query in here, copy it and put it right in here. And then you can have a query instead of pulling over the whole table. And so that's actually really, really useful. And so that is all really interesting stuff. Now, within what we're looking at right here, we'll take a look at that in just a second. But what we're going to do is we're going to come over here to transform data. Let's go ahead and select this. You can see right up here, we have our SQL to blob. That's our pipeline, and we have a bunch of stuff. And then we have our data flow right down here. Now, what our data flow is we're able to take different data sources, different things, transform it, join it, do aggregations, do anything we want to it, and then spit it out wherever we want. If we want to pull all these different files and put into a SQL database, we can do that. If we want to take a bunch of different data and we want to put it into a file, put it into blob storage, we can do that. Or if we want to take multiple tables from a SQL database and then put it into a file, we can do that. And so it's kind of limitless what you can do within here. You just have to kind of know how it works and kind of piece everything together. So let's start building this transformation. Let's come in here and we're going to add a data source. Now within our data source, we can come down here and we need to select a data set. Now these are two data sets that we've already used. These were in the ones that we did when we created the SQL to blob. But let's say we want to create a new data source. If we select a new data source, you'll notice all the different options for this, right? We have a ton of different places and applications that we can pull in. If you just want to scroll down, there's a lot. And so there's a lot of different things. Now we're on a free tier, so we may not be able to use some of these, but if your company's paying for it, you should be able to do it. So let's just say we're going to take it from Azure Blob Storage. We're going to come right here. Ours is a delimited text. Let's go to our link service and go to our storage, and we need to select our data. So let's go to ATA container. And let's take the CSV file .csv. So we just came in here, we're just selecting our data source, and you'll see we select it from our blob storage, and there's the path to it. Let's go ahead and select OK. And there we go. Now, one thing we will want to do as we're going throughout this process is to turn on data preview. So you have to turn on the debug mode. Debug mode is right up here. So data flow debug, and you can let it live for a certain amount of time. This does cost money. It's very cheap, but it's well worth it because as you're doing all these different things, you're going to want to preview the data and see what data looks like as a final result before you push it somewhere, before you put it into a database or a file. So we're just going to wait for just a second while that debug session starts, and then we'll have our data preview available. Now, this is taking forever, and I don't want to wait around forever to keep going. It should work at some point. Maybe we'll see it throughout the process, but we're just going to keep going because if yours is taking as long as mine, we don't need to wait on it because it's not vital. You don't have to have it. So let's come down here. What we can do is we can add another source if we want to. You don't have to, but if you have multiple sources, you can add that. So if you wanted to add a source down here, you just add another source. We aren't going to be doing that, so we can just delete that. But let's click this little button right here because we're going to get a little different options than we have been before. We have a bunch of things that we can do to this data. So let's just scroll down really quickly. You should notice, and you should be able to see a ton of these. And one of the most important is actually this destination, sync destination at the end, and we'll take a look at it in a bit. But we have all of these options to actually change and transform our data. And so if we want to clean the data, if we want to filter the data, if we want to aggregate the data, if we want to pivot the data, there's so many different things that you can do to it. Now, really quick, while we're here, I'm just going to show you the actual data that we're working with. If we open up this file, we have this CSV file. Let's go ahead and open it. And this is the data that is actually in that file that we uploaded. And there's a lot. There's about 32,000 rows of data. We have things like state name, county, city, place, type, etc. And so there's a ton of data in here. But let's say we just want to filter this data. So let's go back. Let's go ahead to don't save. I just wanted to show you what it looked like. Let's go ahead and let's say we want to filter our data. So we're going to come down here. We're going to go to a row modifier, which is filter. And so what we need to do is come down here, and I highly recommend opening up the expression builder, because what we can do is we can say we want to filter on one of these columns. Now over here in the data flow expression builder, we have our expression up here, then we have all of our elements. So we have things like functions, input schemas, parameters, cache lookups, data flow libraries. 99% of the time, you're going to be using functions and your input schema. So our input schema is our table, and the functions are all the functions that we have in here. So we can do one. There's one called equals. Let's do this one right here. So we can do equals. You have your expression. You can even say over here, here's some examples that you can do. But what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to the input schema, and we'll get rid of this. We have something called a state name. So if we come up here, select in there, select state name. So if we do state name, and then in here, let's do Alabama. So what we're saying is we're going to filter where the state name is equal to Alabama. That's what we're going to do. So we're going to save and finish this, and that should be good to go. Let's see if we have a data preview. This hasn't been working for me at all. I hope it's working for you. It's just taking it a normally long time. Maybe because they're not prioritizing me as a small account, which is understandable, but thanks Azure. So now we have this source, we filtered our data, and you can do so many different things in here. We're just not, this isn't a full, lesson on how to use this. Now we need something called a sync. Now what the sync is how you can actually save and publish it, because you can't publish it without a sync. The sync is how you can specify where you're placing this data. So what we're going to do is we can place this anywhere we want. We can place this as a new file. We can put this in our SQL database. Now, if we come in here, we're going to have several different options here. But let's go ahead and select a new one. And let's say we want to put it back in the blob storage. So we're cleaning the data up and we're going to save it as a delimited text file. Let's go ahead and select continue. So now we want to put it in our blob storage again. We need to select our container. Container is going to be ATA container. You could set up another container if you want. Now, I don't think we want to select a file name because we're choosing the file path where we're going to place it. So I think we just need to select OK here. Now, there's one last thing that we want to do before we actually publish all of this. Let's go to settings. And we have some options in here, which is a file name option. Now, when you're doing files in here, in fact, you should probably publish this and just try it and see what happens. But oftentimes you're going to want this as a single file, but that doesn't always happen when you're using Azure. Sometimes it'll make it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 files, depending on what you're doing. So I like to output this as a single file. And then we get to output as a single file, and we can select the name. So we can just put this as, we'll do filtered data, and that's it. I'm actually not sure if I need to do .csv right here. Let's just try it as .csv. Let's go ahead and try to publish this. It looks like it says the file name option output to single file requires single partition be selected in the partition type. So if we come over here, I think it's in optimize for the partition option. You can use current partitioning. We need to select single partitioning. It now says it is fixed. We can close that and let's go ahead and publish all. So what we are going to do is we're going to review this. We have our different data sets and then we have our data flow. So our data flow, we're going to go ahead and publish. These are all changes that we've made throughout this process. It's going to deploy those and then it's going to run this data flow one. And then we should see a new data set, which is filtered based off of our source data. We should see that in our storage account. We should be able to come right up here and it looks like all those things are completed. Now, I forgot we're actually not going to see this because it didn't actually run. It just saved it as a data flow. We need to come up here and we need to create a new pipeline. So let's come up here, create a new pipeline. And what we're going to do is we're going to go down to our data flow. We're just going to drag this over. So this is our data flow and we can name this anything we want. We can say transform, I need to spell that right, transform data. Let's just call it this. And then we need to add a trigger. So we're going to go ahead and say trigger now, and that should run that data flow that we created. So let's go ahead and trigger now. And actually we need to publish it first. So let's go ahead and publish all. We'll publish this and that publishing is completed. And now we can trigger it. So now we're going to say, okay, and it's going to start running. And so this is one of the things just to kind of understand about building data flows and pipelines is that the pipeline, you can do a lot of different things in it, but you're mostly chaining together different data flows. When you actually get in the data flow, you're chaining together all the different combinations that you want to do with different data sets and transformations and data cleaning and all these different things. and then you put it into a pipeline. And that pipeline, when it runs, which I think it's still running, when it runs that data flow that you created. And so these data flows can get really complex, and you can chain multiple data flows together. You can say, once this data flow is done running, then do this. Once this data flow is done running, do this next data flow. And so there's a lot of different things that you can chain together, and it's pretty awesome. So we're just going to wait on this for just a second. And when it is complete, we'll take a look at the output. And there you can see that it succeeded. Let's come over here and take a look. Let's go ahead and refresh this. And let's go to our blob container. And there we go. We have our filtered data.csv. So you can go ahead and check that out. So those two things are working great. Let's go back home really quick. So we've worked on ingestion, we worked on data transformation, and lastly, we have this orchestrate. And let's just come in here really quickly and take a look at how this looks. So as I was telling you before, we have these different pipelines that we've created. We've created a few extras that don't do anything. But what we can do is within this, we can orchestrate this by taking multiple different pipelines, multiple workflows, multiple data sets, and orchestrating all of it into an actual full pipeline. Now with that, and we're not actually going to be doing that right now, but with that, you can see that we have a ton of options right here. And in fact, you can take data from a ton of different places. You can copy data. You can do a Spark job function or even an Azure function. And you can customize so many different things and take data from so many different places. And you can use so many resources within Azure to do just about anything you want. And so, and I don't say that, you know, as in like you can actually do anything, but just look at all these options. There are so many things that you can do. And so I've just given you a brief kind of introduction to ingesting data and transforming data. And then to build these out, you just kind of combine those things together. You say, okay, I want this pipeline right here. And then if that works, then we want to, you know, transfer it over here. And actually we need to do something like this on success. And so you can say, if this works, then on the success of that, we'll do this. And then just for an example, we can say, we'll add this down here and we'll say, if it fails, we'll do this one. And so this is just a demonstration of how this looks. This isn't actually what you should do by any means, but you can give it some different instructions. You can say, if this successfully works, if this pipeline works, then go do this piece. And then if this works, go do this piece. Oftentimes you're going to chain these together. And this is the full orchestration of Azure Data Factory that we're not looking at in this lesson. But you can imagine you're taking data from a client. So the client drops data into a specific location. You ingest that data. So you have a data ingestion data flow. Once that data gets in, then maybe you have one for transforming your data. So if the data ingests properly, then you're going to come up here and you're going to transform the data. Then you'll have another one afterwards. You'll be over here and you'll say, once it's transformed, and then we're going to send an email to me, who is the person who owns that, and saying, hey, this ingestion process worked, or this data pipeline worked. And so you can get really advanced. You can also keep it really simple. And in my time as a data analyst, I worked with a ton of data engineers and data scientists and database developers who use this all the time. So I get in there and I get to mess around with it quite a bit. And oftentimes it was mostly keeping it kind of simple. You're ingesting data, you're transforming the data, and you're placing it in somewhere. There were some use cases where we did a lot more advanced stuff, but this is the meat and potatoes of it. So play around with this, mess around with it, try to get these different things to work, try to create a full end-to-end project. I think that'd be really cool. And maybe I'll do that in a future video. So that is, in general, what ADF kind of is. That's the meat and potatoes of Azure Data Factory.
Now, Azure Synapse Analytics is meant to be this all-in-one place to go for all your data analyst needs. It's going to have ETL, it's going to have workflows, it's going to be able to query data. So it has a lot going for it. So we're going to be taking a look at that. And I'll talk a little bit about the comparisons between Azure Synapse Analytics and a few of the other resources and tools within Azure. So with all that being said, let's jump on my screen and take a look.
All right, so let's go down to our Analytics tab. Let's go over to Azure Synapse Analytics, and let's create a Synapse workspace. As you know, we need to select our subscription and our resource group, and we need to name this. So we'll call this Alex the Analyst, and this is called, oh wait, I need to make them all lowercase. So we'll do Alex the Analyst ASA, Azure Synapse Analytics. That should be good. Now, the next thing that we need to do is select a data lake storage Gen 2. When we are using Azure Synapse Analytics, we are using a data lake. So we need to create an account name for this. So we'll do Alex the Analyst ASA. That should work. Then we need a file system. Now we don't have one. So we're going to create the Alex, the Analyst FS, and let's select OK. Now it says right here, assign myself the storage blob data contributor role for the data lake storage Gen 2 account to interactively query it in the workspace. So we're making ourselves the person who is the main contributor so we can actually use this data lake Gen 2 that we're using. Let's go ahead to review and create. It is going to cost us, because we're using a serverless SQL per terabyte, it's going to cost about $5 USD for that. And that's not a big cost for us. So we're going to go ahead and create that. And that should be covered under your 200. If you had the free $200 credit, that should be covered under that as well. All right, so that was deployed successfully. If you look in here, we did a few different things, or it did a few different things. One, it created a new storage account for us, and that's going to be our data lake. Next, it created our Synapse workspace. So we have the new storage account and we have a new workspace. Let's go to this resource group here. Let's actually come into our Synapse workspace. And you can see a lot of our information up here, but then the most important part, which is Open Synapse Studio. So let's go ahead and open this up. Then we need to go ahead and sign in here. Now let's just take a look at some of the things that's in here, because this should seem pretty reminiscent of Azure Data Factory. And I say that because in our last lesson, we looked at Azure Data Factory and we had a lot of these different things. We had things where we can ingest data, we could transform data, and then we can place it somewhere. And believe it or not, you're able to do that within Azure Synapse Analytics as well. Not only that, within Azure Synapse Analytics, we're going to be able to explore our data and analyze it as well. You can come in here and see how all that works, but this is going to act very much like an Azure Data Studio. If you remember from our SQL Databases video, we looked at Azure Data Studio and how that works and how you can actually access the data. And we'll be coming back to some of these things in a little bit. So we're going to keep this up. Let's come over here and let's take a look at our data. Right now we have no data in here. So let's come in here. Now, if you connect to a SQL database, we're actually creating a SQL database or a lake database, but we don't need that. We're going to connect to external data. In here, we can connect to our Azure Blob Storage. So we're going to go ahead and say continue. And we're just going to bring in some of our data that we've been working with. So we're going to go to the Alex Analyst storage. This is where we have some data in here. And we need to select our subscription right there. There we go. We'll go ahead and create that. So now if we come over here in our workspace, if we go over here to linked, we have our blob storage. Then we have our data lake. Now within our data lake, we don't have any data, but if we come up here to the blob storage, and so as you can see here, we have all of our data that we have in that blob storage. And if we wanted to access one of those, we can do something like select new script. We do a new notebook where we can load to a data frame or a Spark table. We can create a data flow. We can take that as a source. We can transform the data and we can load the data to somewhere else. So there's a lot of things that we can do with this data. One other thing I want to show you just with the data section is we have these browse galleries. And within here, there's a ton of real and really unique data that we can use and we can look at. For example, let's go over here to New York City safety data. Let's go ahead and click continue. There's a bunch of data in here. We're going to add this data set. It's going to take just a second, but it looks like it was created in this sample data sets in Azure Blob Storage. If we come over here, we can click on City Safety New York. Let's go ahead and right click on it, select top 100 rows, and we'll go ahead and run this. As you can see down below, we're just looking at data. So this is how we can run it with SQL. And with this, we can do just about anything we want, right? If we wanted to do some type of group by or joins or anything we want to do, you can do it. This is going to be by default SQL Server. So you can do a lot of things that you want to do in there. But let's just say we wanted to group by category and subcategory. And then up here, we'll select the top. Well, we'll just do all of it, but we'll do select category and subcategory. And then we'll just let's do a count of the subcategory. We're just going to get a count of it. Let's go ahead and run this. And let's take a look. Okay, it looks like our output is correct. I was getting worried at first when I saw the nulls at the beginning, but we could probably we could clean this up a little bit, but we don't need to. Okay, we're just taking a look at what Azure Synapse Analytics can do. So this is where we can query data. We can also save this. We can publish this. And now that's been saved. So if I came over here to the develop, you can see we have SQL script 1. Now we just got to change the name of this if we want to change it to something else. We can come over here. We can say rename. We can say this is the, was this New York City? We'll say group by category. We'll just select OK. And there we go. So now we've saved that script. And so that's really important. That's really, really useful. One other thing that we can do down here is we can also look at this as a chart. Now, this data in and of itself isn't very helpful as a line chart, but if we did a bar chart for the category column, it was the category. And maybe we just want to select the top 10. We'll order by, let's do the count of subcategory. Let's try running this again. We can go look at the table really quickly, and I need to do this descending. Whoops. All right, let's run this again. All right, so there's the data that we want. Let's go back to this chart. Again, this isn't a good visualization. We would do something like a bar chart. We would have the category here, and that'll be fine, but you can customize this a little bit more if you'd like to. But we're able to look at little visualizations in our output when we're working with these SQL scripts. If we want to, we can save that as an image, and that would be great. Again, we can publish this and we can save this, and we are good to go. Now, the next thing that we can do, let's go back to our data. Next thing we can do is we can also create a notebook. So let's load this into a data frame. And you're gonna notice this looks a little bit different. Now, before we can actually run this, we have to create or attach a Spark pool. We don't have one, so we're gonna go create one really quickly. And we'll just call this ATA pool. There we go. We're gonna go back down to review and create. We're going to create this. That was successfully deployed. So our pool is ready to go. So let's go back here. We're gonna go to our ATA pool. And we're going to choose PySpark. That's the one I've almost always used. You can also use SQL in here now. SQL in Azure Synapse Analytics or in other tools, maybe like Databricks and other things like that, they don't always have a SQL option, but now it's being added a lot more. But I used to have to use Scala and PySpark and all sorts of things. But now if you know SQL, you can do that in here too. So you're good to go. This is PySpark though. So we're going to go ahead and run this. And right here, we're running into an issue. Your Spark job requested 24 vCores. However, the workspace has a 12 core limit. And that's because we need to message Azure support and request more. And unfortunately, for this video, we're not going to do that. So let's get a smaller data set. So we're going to come back here to our storage and let's add a new file. And it's going to be this products file right here. Let's go ahead and upload this. And there we go. Now we can go back here. We're going to take a look within our container and we have this products.csv. So let's right click on this. Let's go to new notebook. You can load to data frame or a Spark table, whichever one. We're going to load this to a Spark table. Let's choose our pool and we're using Python. So now let's go ahead and try to run this. Now this didn't work. It says these are the cores of the memory of the driver. Executors exceeded the Spark pool node size. So for this, what we're going to do is we're going to come back here. We're going to edit this and we're going to make it just the smallest one possible because we're just exceeding what we are working with right here. So now that that's updated, let's go back. Let's come right here. All right, and we got our output. Took a while, but that's because we're using a really small pool over here. Now, if you use a larger pool, it'll go a lot faster. So if you select a ton more nodes and you get a larger node size just in general, it's going to go a lot faster. And so right now, oops, let's get out of here. Right now, before, when we tried it with this one, it wasn't working because our node sizes were just too large for what they're allowing us to have. We have to, again, ask them to increase that. But again, that's mostly for really large data sets. For this one, we have a really tiny data set and we get our data right down here. And so everything is working properly. But what we can do, which is really neat, because this is a notebook, is we can come down here, we can write more code. So if you use something like a Jupyter notebook, or there's tons of other notebooks out there that are really great. If you use a notebook, you know you have some code up here. You can put code down here. You can also put markdown. And so you can add in, any title that you want to add in here. You can say, this is a title. We'll go ahead and run this. And another really cool thing about using a notebook, especially within here, is that you don't just have to use Python. If you, for some reason, you say, okay, I want to use SQL, you can do that using this magic command. And you can say .sql, and then you can just write SQL like normal. So you can select everything. We'll come right down here. We'll say from, and right now it's called data frame. But I don't know if that's actually going to work. Let's go ahead and run this. And that's not going to work because it's not in a table. So we can do data frame dot, and we can say create. And there's this option for create or replace temp view. And then we can name it whatever we want. So we can say this data frame to table. So we'll call this that right there. Let's go ahead and run this. And then we'll come down here and replace that right here. Now we can run this. And we just created it into a temporary view. And now we can run this just like we're running SQL. And so there's lots of options that you can do with this. I have 100 tutorials on using Jupyter Notebooks and how to use Python. It's very similar within this. And so it's really neat to be able to combine the two languages. I guess if you want to call SQL a programming language, it's technically not. But we have PySpark, so we can use Python, and we have this as well. And so lots of options, lots of really good stuff in here. And so that's a big part of working with data within Azure Synapse Analytics. Now, if we come down here to integrate, we can create now pipelines, link connections, and copy data tool. We're not using them, but we can use these things. And this is very, very similar to Azure Data Factory. There are also some really good options in here if you want to kind of copy these. Let's say right over here it says bulk copy from files to database. If you want to do that, you can come in here, click continue, and then you can use this. So you can open this pipeline. You can say, this is what I'm looking for. And you select your link service and your other link service. You open the pipeline and it creates that pipeline for you. So just something to be aware of. I think that's really awesome. And in fact, I've used these many times. Let's go ahead and click back. So there's tons and tons of just sample things where if you are doing one of these, let's say you want to create a system that deletes files older than 30 days, there you go. And so there's tons of things in here that you can use, as well as there's different SQL scripts you can use, different notebooks, different data sets. These are all free things that you can use within Azure Synapse Analytics. But let's get out of here. Let's go ahead and close this out. So let's say we do actually want to use something and integrate. Let's use this copy data tool. And this should look extremely, extremely familiar if you use the Azure Data Factory, if you took that lesson. Now we're just going to copy it from blob storage. We'll go to next. We'll go to browse and we'll just select a file. So we're going to come in here. We have our products data. So we're going to take that products data. We're going to select next. And it wants to know what our file format is. Right now we have it kind of as a CSV and we don't need any compression. So we're going to go ahead and keep it as is. And we need to select our destination. Now we can put this in almost any place we want. In fact, Azure SQL Database would be a perfectly good spot for it. We're just demonstrating how to move one thing to another. So I'm going to select Azure Blob Storage. We're just going to place it in the exact same one, exact same container. We're going to make some weird copy of this. Let's go ahead and click OK. And we need to select the file name. Now the file name is going to be products_copied. That's all we're going to do, .csv. So now we'll select next. We'll select next. And our task name is going to be copy data. We'll do underscore. So copy data. And we'll select next. And we're going to select next. Now, I'm not going to deep dive into the transformation and the pipelines and all those things because that's what we did in Azure Data Factory, and in Azure Synapse Analytics, it's very, very similar. Now you can see here we have this pipeline built. We can come right over here and this pipeline is ready to go. All we have to do is we have to publish it and then add a trigger. So let's go ahead and publish all. We're going to go ahead and publish this. Now that we've published it, we can add this trigger. We're going to say trigger now. I'm going to click OK. So as we looked at in Azure Data Factory, once we publish it, it saves it. We can add this trigger. We can run it to trigger it now to actually activate that process. And now it's going to copy that data over. Now that should take a little bit of time, but we can view that pipeline running. And it looks like it just succeeded. We can go back to our storage account. We're going to refresh our storage really quickly. Go back to our blob containers. And there you can see we have products_copied.csv. So even within Azure Synapse Analytics, we can create these workflows and these pipelines. So let's go back over here, back to the integrate. So this integrate allows us to do just about almost everything that we were doing within Azure Data Factory. It is a little bit more limiting, but we copied some data. That's what we worked with. And there's a bunch of other things in here as well. So you can create full data pipelines within Azure Synapse Analytics, just like you can Azure Data Factory. But within Azure Synapse Analytics, we can also use the data. So we can take a look at the data and we can run queries on it, and we can create different notebooks as well. This is really awesome stuff that we're able to do. So Azure Synapse Analytics is really meant for a more mature data team. If they're using large amounts of data, again, this sits on top of a data lake. So you're creating all these pipelines, you're working with all these different data sets, and you're querying the data, you're using the data, you're transforming the data. That's what this is really, really for. And so if you come back over here to the home, you can see that we ingested some data, we explored and analyzed some data. We also have visualized data. Now, if we click in here, we can connect to Power BI. We don't have an actual workspace for Power BI set up, so we can't do that. But this is meant to be something that you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be able to ingest it, explore it, and then visualize it all in one place. So it makes the work for data analysts or even data scientists quite easy. If you have kind of a smaller team, or depending on your team, what data and tools you use, you may be able to do most of your work within Azure Synapse Analytics. Again, just depending on how everything's configured. But if you have a lot more complex systems, a lot larger data sets coming from a lot of different data sources, you may need to go branch out and use some of these other tools like SQL Databases. Azure Data Factory has standalone tools, but sometimes you're able to get it all within Azure Synapse Analytics, all your ingestion, your data analysis, and your data visualization all in one place. And so this is a really powerful tool, and this is one that I used for quite a while. And so just coming in here, this is really bringing me back to one of my previous data analyst jobs where we were in here all the time. Now, one thing to note, and I didn't really mention this, is that this is actually a workspace. And so we have this workspace that you can then share and you can collaborate with people on. And so if you're over here in a notebook and you're trying to run it, and it's not working, or whatever it is, we can run this one real quick. It'll take a second. We can run these, and you can collaborate with other people, and they can see your code. So then you can, publish this, and you can save this, and all these different things, and other people can view this. And so it's kind of more of a collaborative environment as well, which is really nice. So get in here, mess around with it a little bit. This is kind of just a little crash course on how to get up and running and some of the features of Azure Synapse Analytics. And this is a really great tool to know how to use. And I hope that was helpful. I hope you got kind of a good overview of how Azure Synapse actually works. If you have not already, be sure to check out my full course on Azure and AWS on analystbuilder.com. Be sure to like and subscribe below, and I will see you in the next video.